Let me just say, first of all, you know, I'm a trade unionist. I live locally, actually, just around the corner from here. I'm a former president of the RMT union, and when I was president of the union, we adopted the policy of calling for a vote, a referendum on Britain's membership in the European Union, and committing the union to support a campaign to leave the European Union in the event of any referendum. And that was the result of a prolonged discussion and debate that was going on in our union, led by people like Bob Crow. And that debate came out of the material reality that our members were experiencing. And transport workers who we represent were some of the people who were most affected by the liberalisation directives that were promulgated by the European Union, most affected by globalisation. So it was the seafarers, the most globalised workforce in the world, who felt the first impact of globalisation in the 1970s and 80s with flags of convenience. And of course, globalisation in the maritime industry doesn't start in the 70s and 80s, it goes back to the beginnings of empire. And we could have a very detailed historical discussion about the impact of imperialism, racism, and exploitation in the maritime industries. But certainly for transport workers, those arguments were a reality. They weren't a theoretical question about what might happen in the future if the European Union passed a liberalisation package that liberalised a sector of the economy. We were already in it. And what we were seeing in the 1990s was that railways were being privatised, first in Britain, and then subsequently, as Eddie referred to, in France, where the freights, the ignorance of Remainers and many on the left in this country who talk about European railways as though they are nationalised railway systems, who know nothing about the struggles of our brothers and sisters in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Spain, who've been on strike time and time again against the impact of liberalisation directives from the European Union, which have led directly to the closure of rail factories, to the privatisation of parts of their industries, and the emaciated state-owned rail companies which are surviving and clinging on at the moment in some of the European countries, but are basically being eaten up by the big players in the European rail market. So our members saw the impact of that when, freight workers on the railway in this country were privatised in the 1990s under the John Major's government. The company which ended up buying their company was Deutsche Bahn. So now in West London, where I'm a branch secretary for the RMT union, we have workers working in a huge freight yard in Acton who work for Deutsche Bahn. That's the company that's bought the freight sector, or a large portion of the freight sector, in our rail industry in this country. The same thing has happened in Holland. In the Netherlands, the entire freight sector of the Dutch National Railway was sold lock, stock and barrel to Deutsche Bahn. So the idea that privatisation was a uniquely British experience, promulgated by Tories, and had nothing to do with the development of a liberalised market across the European Union, is a fiction that has been promulgated by many people who do know better and should know better. And if to answer the question that this meeting was called around, strategies, socialist strategies for leaving the European Union, the first strategy that we've got to have is to tell the truth. We've got to educate people. The level of bad faith arguments that have been going on in the left for the last 3.5 years since the 2016 referendum is absolutely disgraceful. Absolutely. Whether you're talking about questions of immigration, free movement of labour, and the confusion that goes on, the deliberate confusion that goes on between the interpretation of what immigration is and what free movement of labour is, whether you're talking about the privatisation impact of EU liberalisation directives, there's a huge amount of bad faith confusion and deliberate confusion created in these arguments. So for socialists, the priority has got to be to tell the truth to the people, to educate people, rather than to tell lies to people, which is what the capitalists are doing. Now, Eddie said at the end of his peroration that the EU is an empire, It's about imperialism. And I want to turn to this question because before I address the practical questions about what the left needs to do, John, I want to turn to this question because it struck me listening to the professor when I arrived, and apologies for my late arrival, by the way, Professor. I've come straight from work. But it struck me listening to the professor that there is a theoretical question that's confronting us here, and we shouldn't ghost over it and ignore it. What the professor was talking about was a world where the state, the nation state, had ceased to exist. Effectively, had ceased to be a vehicle, a historical vehicle for the organisation of society. And instead, corporations had swept aside the 250-year-old nation state and in its place had erected these concepts such as free movement of labour, free movement of capital, free movement of goods and services, globalisation, capitalist globalisation. Now, I think this is actually not what is happening. That is the appearance. That is what they would like us to think is happening. But that is not the underlying reality, the essence of the world as it is. In reality, material exploitation, ownership, property rights, armies, taxation, imperialism is carried out still by nation states, by powerful nation states. They try to disguise their actions as being the actions of natural laws, such as free movement of capital. They talk about the right of capital to move, as though dead labour, which is what capital is, as though dead labour has a right, has any rights at all. They talk about it as if it has human rights, and yet it is dead labour, congealed labour, as Marx called it. This idea that free movement, that globalisation is a reality, is an underlying law of nature, is a lie that we're being told, and we should be exposing it. The nation state, which is a historical, epochal development in humanity, is still the critical foundation block, and particularly for socialists, it's important to recognise this, it is a foundation block where a degree of democracy can be fought for and won. And Marx said the battle for socialism lies, or the road to socialism lies through the battle for democracy. And we've got to hold on to this idea, because in order to understand our enemies and to understand imperialism, it is important to understand what Lenin said, and to understand that the nation state has not disappeared. 12 years ago, when global capitalism went into its last major spasm, in 2007 and 8, the global financial crisis, it was nation states which rescued global capitalism. As Gordon Brown told us at the time, we've saved capitalism. What's going on at the moment in the Middle East? The incredible imperialist conflagration that we're seeing taking place between Turkey, Syria, Russia, very likely Iran, very likely Saudi Arabia. This is a war that is being fought by nation states, not by immutable forces of global capital. It is organised through nation states, and it is a question of imperialism. So I think it's important on a theoretical point not to elide over this. Globalisation is what they would like us to think the world is like. What the world is really like is what's happening in Syria, is what's happening now where nation states are confronting each other in a state of war. That is the underlying reality of the world that we live in, and we shouldn't try and confuse those two things. In terms of what our job is to do here in Britain, well, let's just get a couple of things clear that perhaps haven't been mentioned. One is we're witnessing right now in this country the biggest crisis of our own ruling class that has happened in living memory, and probably since the early mid-19th century, since the great split in the Tories over the Corn Laws, or the great arguments over imperial preference in the 1880s and 1890s. The ruling class cannot govern in the old way, as Lenin said. of course, what we don't have is a working class that is organised, that is armed, that is theoretically able to step in and take over. We've got a movement which is quite feeble. It shows some good signs of revival, and we've just seen today the brilliant result that the Communication Workers Union have won in their national ballot. Over 80% turnout in a postal ballot, which, as any trade unionist will tell you, is almost unheard of, and a massive, massive majority for taking strike action against the Royal Mail. So there are clear signs that where workers are organised and mobilised and armed with the right arguments, they're ready to fight. But we all know that most of the working class is not in that position that the CWU members are in, and that some other trade unionists have managed to win in their workplaces. We're in a weak position, and we're particularly weak because the leaders of our movement, the leaders of the working class movement, the trade union leaders and the leading forces in the Labour Party have failed completely to represent the will of their members to leave the European Union. Even though I'm congratulating the Communication Workers Union on their brilliant result, it has to be said that the Communication Workers Union is almost silent on the impact of European Union postal liberalisation directives on their members' jobs. And yet the reason why Royal Mail are threatening their members' jobs is because Royal Mail is in a race to the bottom with fly-by-night liberalised delivery companies that want to cherry-pick the best and most profitable routes from the Royal Mail. It's a race to the bottom that's been created by European Union postal liberalisation directives. But you won't really hear that argument being made by Dave Ward. What you'll hear from Dave Ward, quite rightly, is the need to fight to defend what you've got, but not explaining why you're being attacked in the way that you are. And Dave Ward's one of the better trade union general secretaries in this country. When you look at the role that's been played by the TUC, and the TUC's never been a progressive organisation. I don't care, which I think the quip that I mentioned to you in Brighton, Arthur, was that Hugh McGrillen, who some people in this room may remember, who was chair of the London MSF union a few years ago, who died about 10 years ago, used to say, there's a saying in my family that each TUC General Secretary is worse than the one before. And certainly that's historically accurate if you trace it through the line. But the situation we've got to now is that the TUC has transformed itself into a more able advocate for the interests of British finance capital than even the CBI. It's quite an extraordinary step that they've taken. So we're in a very weak position in terms of the leadership that's going into our movement. We need better arguments. We need to get them out there. How do we do it? Because the time to make those arguments is now. The ruling class is in crisis. The working class is not yet ready to take its place. We have to give them the arguments. The organisation that we've tried to set up in order to put out those arguments is called Leave, Fight, Transform. I'm a member of the Communist Party. It was set up by the Communist Party along with members of the Labour Party who support leaving the European Union. We have support from Socialists who are not members of any organisations, as well as we've had John Tyrrell from the Socialist Labour Party come to our initial organising forum. Arthur has spoken on a fringe meeting platform that we organised at the TUC this year. We're very keen to work with class struggle, socialists, Marxists, people on the left who understand that the need to put socialist arguments to workers, to our movement about leaving the European Union is not an add-on to this debate. It is absolutely essential. If those arguments aren't put now, we could well end up in a week's time, after the 31st of October, with some deal done. And this is what they're saying on the news tonight, that in the next 24 hours a deal could be done which would have a customs union border in the Irish Sea. Who would think that a Conservative and Unionist Party government would be the one that would put a customs union in the Irish Sea and unite the island of Ireland in terms of customs? It's extraordinary. But then, only a Labour government led by Tony Blair could have piloted privatisation of the NHS. And it takes a snake in the grass to really do damage, and this is where we could be next week, unless the left is able to stand up on a public platform, overcome all the obstacles, all the attempts to shut us out of the debate, all the attempts by the BBC, by The Guardian, by Channel 4 News to say that people who support Brexit are on the right and people who support the European Union are on the left. Unless we break that false dichotomy, that picture that's been painted by the media, then we are delivering the working class into the hands of the right for the next political generation. So that's the task that we're taking on with Leave, Fight, Transform. Now that doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything. There are people who I fundamentally disagree with on all sorts of things in that in the campaign. But what we need to do is draw out people in the Labour Party, including MPs, including members of the shadow cabinet, who actually support leaving the European Union, but won't mention it in public in case it frightens the horses. But they exist, and little by little they're starting to make the argument. We need to coax them out. It will give courage to other Labour Party members, to other trade unionists, to workers more generally, to people who are intimidated by the lies of the mass media, if we can get publicly known politicians to come off the fence and say that they're in favour of fighting for a working class Brexit, for a Labour Brexit. And that's what we've got to do. So that's the task we've set ourselves. I'm very grateful for your time tonight. It's always an absolute honour and a privilege to speak on a platform with Arthur Scargill. And thank you very much for inviting us.